They tied her wrists with fraying rope, just tight enough to bruise but not to bleed. Isabel stood barefoot on the raised cart in the village square, the chill of the Scottish morning stinging her skin, her hair tangled from days without shelter. Around her the crowd gathered, not in outrage, but in casual interest, the way they might inspect a goat or a sack of oats. "Healthy," one man said, spitting into the straw. "Strong hips." Another laughed. "She'll birth fine, that one." Isabel stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, refusing to cry. She had done that already, in the barn where they held her, in the wagon that dragged her here. Her master's debt had become her sentence. Sold to settle the coin he'd squandered at cards. Sold like livestock. No one would stop it. The sheriff nodded in boredom. The butcher's wife looked away. Even the priest had walked by with his head bowed. When the auctioneer raised his hand, she heard the number as if it belonged to someone else. £2, 2 shillings. Silence. Then, 3, a voice shouted, not from the front but from the edge of the crowd. Heads turned. A man stood there, tall, weather-worn, arms crossed over a dark wool coat stitched with Highland patterning. His eyes were unreadable, but they were fixed on her, not like a man choosing a prize, but like someone who'd seen war and knew its wounds when he saw them. £3, 4, someone else shouted. Isabel's stomach dropped. She had become a bid, a contest. 5, said the Highlander again, louder. No one answered. The gavel dropped. Sold. The rope was cut. She stumbled forward, unsure if her legs would hold. The man said nothing, only handed over the coin. When she met his eyes, she found no pity, only something colder, more resolute. "You're not livestock," he said quietly, his accent thick with the north. "You don't owe me." And then he turned and walked away. She followed because she had nowhere else to go. But something in her bones told her this man, this stranger, might not be her owner. He might be her undoing, or her beginning. He didn't speak much as they left the market behind, only offered her a cloak that smelled of pine and fire and something older, heather from the Highlands. Isabel clutched it tight, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. Men who paid for women didn't often ask their names. They crossed through the muddy village outskirts and into open hills, past the ruins of stone crofts long abandoned. She followed without asking where they were headed. She didn't care. Every step was farther from the jeering crowd, from the auction block, from the rope. That was enough. They camped that night beneath a gnarled oak tree. He gathered kindling in silence while she sat on a patch of dry moss, her hands still trembling. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. He returned with a pouch of oat bread and a strip of salted venison. "Eat," he said. She hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. He sat down, unwrapping his own food. "Because I was once sold too, not like you, but close enough." She studied him. His face was marked by wind and years, but not cruelty. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of cliffs. Cold, proud, impossible to move. "You're Highland," she said. He nodded once. "Name's Ewan. No clan. Not anymore." She raised an eyebrow. "How does a man without a clan end up at a market saving strangers?" He didn't smile. "Some debts are repaid in silence." He handed her a flask of water. "You don't need to explain what they did to you. I don't need your story. I just need you to survive." Isabel looked at him, heart thudding in her chest. "And when I do, then you choose where you go next. But until then, you're under my watch." She ate in silence, barely tasting the food, but feeling it warm her from the inside. That night, as she lay wrapped in his cloak beneath a sky cracked with stars, she listened to the wind sighing through the grass and wondered who Ewan really was. A stranger, yes, but not a threat. Maybe not a savior either, something in between. a shadow that chose to shield instead of strike, and for the first time since she was taken, she slept without nightmares. The fire crackled softly as dawn bled across the hills, casting a pale gold glow over the dew-soaked grass. Isabel awoke to the smell of smoke and warmth, not the stench of sweat and damp straw she had grown used to, but something cleaner, calmer. Ewan was already up, crouched beside the embers, sharpening a blade with slow, precise strokes. His movements were quiet, not secretive, just practiced. She watched him for a moment, wondering how many mornings he'd woken like this, alone, guarded, waiting for something that never came. "Were you a soldier?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Aye." "Whose side?" He paused, eyes flickering toward her, then back to the blade. "The wrong one." She sat up slowly, wrapping the cloak tighter around her shoulders. "What happened?" "Lost everything. Land, kin, honor, if I ever had it." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he'd told the story so many times it had become something separate from him. "And now you spend your time saving women who've been sold like sheep?" she asked, her voice sharper than she meant. He finally looked at her. "No," he said, "just you." Isabel blinked, unsure what to do with the weight of that answer. "Why?" He slid the blade into its sheath and stood. "Because you looked straight ahead on that cart. Not at the ground, not at your feet. You looked like someone still fighting." She swallowed hard. "I'm not strong." "You don't have to be, just awake." He turned and packed away the firestones. "We leave in 10 minutes. She stood, legs still stiff, heart beating louder than it had in days. As they walked through the heather-covered hills, her mind wandered to the men who had dragged her from her cottage, who'd laughed as her master signed the sale. She had vowed then to never trust a man again, and yet here she was, following one who hadn't asked her name until she gave it, who built a fire with his back to her and never once looked twice when she undressed to wash in the river. She didn't know where they were going, but for the first time it felt like a road she had chosen, not as a captive, not as property, but as a woman walking beside a man who asked for nothing, and gave her back something she thought was lost: dignity. They climbed for hours, the terrain turning rough beneath their feet, the wind sharper with every ridge they crossed. The Highland peaks rose like ancient bones from the earth, jagged and unmoved by time. Isabel's breath came hard and fast, but she didn't complain. Not once. Ewan moved ahead, steady as a drumbeat, his boots carving a path through stone and moss. When they reached the crest, she nearly collapsed from exhaustion, but the view stole her breath again. Below them lay a glen untouched by roads or smoke, a quiet valley folded between mountains where deer moved like whispers through the trees and a river shimmered like silver thread. Ewan pointed to a small cabin nestled near the forest's edge. "Mean," he said simply. "What's left of it." "You live here?" He gave a single nod. "Off the path. Safe." As they descended, the wind carried faint scents: peat, pine, the smoky tang of old firewood. The cabin was weathered but strong, its stones blackened at the base, its roof patched with care. He opened the door without hesitation, letting her step in first. The room was small, a hearth, a table, one bed, and shelves lined with dried herbs, tools, and weapons. Everything had a place. Nothing felt cruel. "You'll have the bed," he said. "I've slept on floors before." "You shouldn't have to," she replied. He didn't argue. That night, she sat by the hearth while he stirred stew in a battered pot. She couldn't stop watching his hands, how capable they were, how gently they moved, how unlike the ones that had bound her wrists weeks ago. "Why did you leave your clan?" she asked quietly. "They left me," he said. "After the war, there was no place for soldiers who couldn't forget what they'd done." "And now you live like this?" It's not living, he admitted. It's waiting until something matters again. She looked at him, the flicker of firelight dancing in her eyes. Do I matter? He looked up, meeting her gaze fully for the first time. You didn't, until I saw them try to break you, and you stayed whole. She blinked hard. I'm not whole. Then I'll help you hold the pieces. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was full of something neither of them dared name yet. But it had started, a flicker, a fire, a reason. The peace didn't last. It never does. Not when men with power have been told no. 3 days after they arrived at Ewan's cabin, Isabel spotted movement from the trees, shadows that didn't belong to deer. She said nothing at first, but she noticed Ewan reaching for his blade more often, waking at the sound of snapping branches. They didn't speak about fear, but it hung in the air like fog, heavy and impossible to ignore. That evening, as she collected water from the stream, she saw them, 2 figures crouched near the slope above the path, watching. One wore the red sash of the sheriff's guard, the other she recognized from the auction. A man with breath that stank of ale and hands that laughed when they bruised. Isabel didn't scream. She turned slowly and walked back up the path, heart pounding like hooves on wet earth. When she stepped into the cabin, Ewan looked up and saw her face. They're here, she said. He stood. No questions, no panic, just motion. He bolted the door and drew 2 short swords from the rack. They'll want you back, he said, handing her a knife. Not just for debt, for pride. I'm not going, she said. I won't run again. He looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them. Then we make it hard for them. Night fell. The forest outside grew still. And then the knock came, not gentle, not asking. We've come for the girl, a voice shouted. She belongs to the court. No, Ewan called, his voice ringing through the door like a bell tolling war. She belongs to no one. You going to keep a whore in your woods, Highlander? Another voice sneered. That your penance? Isabel stepped beside him, knife in hand. I am not what they named me, she whispered. He nodded. Then show them. When they tried to break through the door, Ewan met them like a storm, blade flashing, voice silent but his fury louder than thunder. Isabel stayed close, striking when one lunged at her with iron chains. She didn't miss. By morning, 2 men limped back toward town, bloody, beaten, and empty-handed. Ewan sat by the fire, his arm bleeding but his eyes calm. It's done, she said, binding his wound. He looked at her, tired and quiet. No, he replied. Now it begins. They didn't speak of the fight again, though the bruises on Ewan's ribs and the cut on Isabel's hand said plenty. The cabin, once a quiet refuge, felt different now, not unsafe, but claimed, marked, no longer just a place to hide, but a place defended, a place chosen. Days passed. Ewan healed slowly, stubbornly, refusing rest. Isabel spent her time gathering herbs, boiling roots, learning how to mend more than wounds. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty now, it was shared. Until one morning, she found something strange outside the door. A sprig of rowan tied with red thread, placed carefully on the stone step. She froze. Ewan, reading in the corner, looked up and saw her face. What is it? Rowan wards, she whispered. Witches used to leave them to warn travellers or welcome them. Ewan stepped out into the morning light and scanned the trees. We're not alone. That afternoon, they heard movement on the ridge, but this time it wasn't soldiers. It was a girl, barefoot, thin, carrying a bundle of cloth in her arms. Behind her came an older woman, eyes hollow with grief, and behind them another. Women, 3 of them. Ewan said nothing, only stepped aside. Isabel opened the door. You heard? She asked. The oldest nodded. Word reached the valley that a man stood for a girl no one wanted, that he bled for her and she bled too, and they didn't break. Ewan's eyes narrowed. And what do you want? To rest, the old woman said, to remember who we were before they sold us or broke us or made us small. Isabel looked at him. We have room. For how many? He asked. She didn't answer. By nightfall there were 7, a glen of exiles, of women cast out, of names erased. They slept on the floor, by the hearth, on spare blankets and coats. They brought nothing but silence and bruises and quiet hope. And in the morning Isabel looked at the hills and saw them differently, not as boundaries, but as walls around something worth guarding. She stood beside Ewan, their hands brushing once, then staying. This is no longer your cabin, she said softly. He nodded. It's a sanctuary now. And though he didn't smile, his eyes warmed, not with pride, but with purpose. The knock came at midday, measured, deliberate, not the frantic pounding of a thief, nor the coward's fist of a man seeking revenge. When Ewan opened the door, the sheriff stood on the path, flanked by 2 riders and a parchment held like a blade. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. That made him more dangerous. We've heard stories, he said calmly, that a girl bought at market now runs a gathering of vagrants, that a former soldier shelters them, teaches them defiance. Ewan didn't answer. The wind moved between them like a held breath. The council doesn't like defiance, the sheriff continued, especially not from women who forgot their place. From behind Ewan, Isabel stepped forward, her dress plain but her chin high. We haven't forgotten, she said. We remember too well. The sheriff looked her over, his eyes slow, appraising. This is not a haven. It's an infestation. You draw trouble. Ewan crossed his arms. Then why come alone? A flicker in the sheriff's eyes. To give you a chance. Disband. Send them home. Whatever hole they crawled out of. There are no homes left, Isabel said, voice sharp. Only this one. Then you'll be burned out, he replied, handing Ewan the parchment. That's law. Ewan took the scroll but didn't open it. Law changes when the wrong men write it. And right becomes wrong when fire spreads, the sheriff said. Then he turned and rode off, his coat whipping behind him like a banner. The others came to the door, their faces pale. What do we do? One whispered. We stay, Isabel said. We build. And when they come, then we won't be small, she said. We'll be ready. Ewan finally opened the parchment. A formal decree. Vacate within 5 days or face destruction. He tossed it into the fire. If they want our silence, he muttered, then they've forgotten who they're trying to silence. That night, the women gathered around the hearth. They made a list of what they had. Blankets, tools, dried food, and each other. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing, and more than any of them had started with. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow. Inside, they braided rope, sharpened sticks, stoked fire. They didn't prepare for war. They prepared for dignity, for the right to live unbroken, together. The first torch lit the sky before midnight, a cruel streak of flame against the stars. Isabel saw it through the narrow window slit. The sheriff hadn't waited 5 days. He had come in 3. From the trees, shadows moved with purpose, cloaks pulled tight, boots muffled in frost. 10 men, maybe more, no court, no law, just fire and fear. They want to burn it, she said quietly. Ewan nodded, pulling on his old leather coat, the one marked with salt and blood. Let them try. But he didn't reach for his sword. Instead, he handed Isabel a long cloth sack. Inside, oil-drenched rags, mirrors, old scrap metal bent into angles. They expect a fight, he said. We'll give them something better. The women moved like breath. No panic, no screams, just action. The youngest scattered the rags in the woods. 2 others dipped ropes into the stream, creating steam traps. Ewan and Isabel climbed to the ridge behind the cabin, where a high wall of rock overlooked the glen. Below, the first flames licked at the edge of their fence. A man laughed. Smoke them out like rats! But when they kicked down the gate, they found nothing. No bodies. No sobbing women. Just a trail of footprints leading into trees and smoke that stung more than it should. One by one, the sheriff's men began to stumble, eyes watering, lungs choking. Isabel had soaked the moss with wild onion and thistle, a burning sting that clouded the eyes and stripped the throat raw. From the ridge, Ewan released a single arrow into the stack of mirrors mounted on the trees. Light burst through smoke. Disorienting, blinding, screams rose, not of pain, but of confusion. "Where are they?" one shouted. "This place is cursed." Another coughed. The sheriff didn't retreat. He stepped forward, torch high. "I see you, Highlander," he called. "You can't keep them forever." Ewan didn't answer. He stood beside Isabel, calm as a mountain. "He won't leave," she said. "Then he'll learn what happens when you treat people like cattle." The final flare came from the chapel bell, the one they'd salvaged from a ruined church now hung at the glen's edge. When it rang, the valley echoed, not with surrender but with warning. The sheriff froze, and when he turned back, the women stood at the tree line, not hiding, not weeping, waiting, together, unafraid. By morning, smoke still curled above the treetops, but the sheriff and his men were gone, limping, coughing, humiliated. They hadn't burned the cabin, they hadn't broken the women, and most importantly, they hadn't returned with chains. What remained behind was mess, trampled soil, scorched fence posts, a cracked window pane, but no one mourned. Not this time. They cleaned in silence, not solemn, steadfast. When the sun reached its highest point, Ewan gathered stones from the riverbed and stacked them into a low circle. "What's that for?" Isabel asked, wiping soot from her hands. "A hearth," he said. "A new one we all build." The women gathered, curious. One brought wood, another brought the iron pot, and together, without ceremony, they built something permanent. No longer guests, no longer fugitives, founders. That night, they cooked as one. Root stew, flatbread, hot ash cakes. The air was filled with laughter, the kind that had been buried under fear for years. Even the quiet ones smiled. Even Ewan allowed a corner of his mouth to twitch. Isabel sat with him near the fire. Elspeth, the youngest of the new arrivals, curled beside her like a sleeping pup. "What now?" she asked. He tossed a branch into the flames. "Now, we stay. Even if they come again, they will," he said. "But this place, it's ours now. We make it more than a hiding place. We make it a truth." She looked around at the circle of women. "Then we give it a name." "A name," he repeated, "so that when they speak of it, they speak of us." She stood and faced the fire. The others looked up. "From this night forward," she said, her voice steady, "this place is not a camp, not a cabin, not a crime. It is Kaya Solas." "Sanctuary of light," whispered one of the older women. "Aye," said Isabel, "because when they tried to burn us down, we didn't run. We burned brighter." Ewan rose beside her. He said nothing, but he reached for her hand in full view of everyone. No shame, no pretense, just truth. The flames crackled louder. Above them the stars broke through the smoke, and the wind, once cold and cruel, carried warmth instead, not just from the fire, but from the oath they had made. To never be sold again, to never stand alone. Years later, the glen was no longer silent. Laughter rolled through its trees like spring water, and the old cabin had grown into a cluster of stone cottages bound together by rope, bridges, herb gardens, and stories whispered by candlelight. Caer Solars had become a myth to the outside world, a place of women who vanished from cruelty and rose again in the mist. Some called it cursed, others called it holy. None dared approach without reverence. Isabel stood beneath the bell they had raised together, now mounted on a carved wooden archway at the glen's edge. A boy clung to her skirt, bright-eyed and wild-haired, his breath visible in the crisp morning air. "Mamma, is it true you were a prisoner once?" he asked. She knelt and looked him in the eye. "No," she said softly. "I was something worse. I was owned." He frowned. "But who owns you now?" She smiled and touched his heart. "Only this." Behind her, Ewan walked slowly along the stone path, older now, grey streaking his beard, but his eyes still the same, quiet storms of loyalty and fire. He placed his hand on the child's shoulder and said nothing, as always. But his presence spoke louder than history. That afternoon, the women gathered in the long hall built where the first fire circle had stood. They wrote names in a book, not of those who had left them, but of those who had returned to themselves. Names that once belonged to the auction block, the servants' register, the court dockets. Names reclaimed. Isabel's was at the top, not as maid, not as property, just Isabel of Caer Solis. Beside it, Ewan had written his name for the first time in over a decade, not just to claim a place, but to surrender to one. They rang the bell again that evening, as they did every year on the night of the first torch, the night they chose to remember not the fire that came to destroy them, but the fire they carried forward. And when the wind moved through the glen, it didn't howl like it once did. It hummed like a lullaby only the free could hear. Because some places are born from pain, but the best ones, they are built from women who refused to kneel, and men who stood beside them in silence, until it became strength.